Jessica, and thank you all for this has been a jam-packed day, and thank you all for hanging in right to the bitter end, and hopefully we can have a nice cocktail party when this is all over as a reward for listening to our panel, the last one of the day. Paul, thank you for joining us. I don't know if Tiffany is joining in, but at the moment I see you on the screen, so thank you very much for zooming into the call. I know I speak for all of you in saying how much we're looking forward to our panel's insights and perspectives on global capital, the importance of developing much-needed infrastructure, and public-private-indigenous partnerships and investments. I won't introduce each speaker right this second, but we'll ask each to make brief introductory statements in a few minutes' time, after which we'll have hopefully a good, rich discussion. And after that, we'll open the floor to Q&A, so please have lots of topics. Jessica and Madeleine, in their opening remarks, reminded us of the need to convince others of what we all know about the value of the North, not only as a home for so many, but also as a vital and strategic part of our national fabric and our national interests. This event is an important part of the dialogue, but it's not enough. More needs to be done to convince the financial, engineering, institutional investment, and governmental communities to engage. This morning, the Globe and Mail had a front-page story entitled "China Steps Up Arctic Presence Through Alliance with Russia," which the UK Deputy High Commissioner mentioned in the last session. The article went on to talk about how China is using Russia's real estate in the Arctic to achieve critical strategic footholds in that part of the world. Also this morning at our opening session with Pan-Arctic ambassadors, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, David Cohen, commented, and I'll quote, "Infrastructure gaps will be exploited by malaligned players." I'm not sure how many alarm bells have to ring before we convince Canadians and others around the Arctic region of the urgent infrastructure needs in the Arctic. In the past few days, we've also had a few more articles in the Globe, one entitled, "Canadian Pension Funds Must Invest More in the Resource Sector." And a big chunk of that article talked about the need to invest more in Canada. Another, on Monday of this week, was entitled, "Despite Skepticism Throughout the Financial World, ESG is not being eliminated, it's just evolving." These are two timely and important topics that we intend to discuss with our panel. In addition, we want to hear our panel's insights into capacity building within Indigenous communities, the role of capital pools in advancing Indigenous investment, direct foreign investment, again, China springs to mind, the federal budget, and if time permits, some examples of best practices and perhaps ones to avoid in building infrastructure in the North. We're fortunate to have experts from some of the leading players in Canada, from the private sector, from the pension industry, legal and institutional investment world, and from Indigenous development corporations in the NWT, Nunavut, and Yukon. So we have lots to discuss. Let's start with a roundtable of introductions, and Daryl, let's start with you.
Okay. My name is Daryl Bolio. I'm the CEO for Denendeh Investments, which is owned by the 27 First Nations of the Northwest Territories.
Good afternoon. I'm Darren Bain, the CEO of Concert Infrastructure. Our shareholders at Concert are 10 British Columbia-based union and management pension plans. And our primary investment objectives as an equity fund are to invest in develop and manage Canadian public infrastructure projects, As an example, we're the primary investor and manager of the Iqaluit International Airport.
Thank you. My name is Shahir Gindi. Just finishing my term as a national co-chair of Osler Hoskin. Much of my practice is in alternatives investment, working with pension funds and other private equity players and sponsors from around the world, deploying their capital in Canada or Canadian money deploying its capital outside of Canada. And have more to say later.
I'm Hilary Thatcher, and I'm the Managing Director for Indigenous and Northern Infrastructure at the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a Crown corporation. It was created in late 2017 and sort of started hiring some staff in 2018. And we've sort of, been criticized for having a slow start, but we've really hit our stride and are making a number of investments, in particular in the Indigenous space, across 5 asset classes, being clean power, so energy transition, things like wind, solar, hydro, SMRs, transmission, green infrastructure, water, wastewater, energy retrofits, hydrogen, RNG, trade and transport, which is rail, bridges, roads, ports, airports, broadband, so connectivity and connecting Canadians, and public transit. And again, we're an impact investor, and I will have lots more to say as we move through the questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Lode. I'm the Senior Managing Director for Sustainable Investing and Innovation at OP Trust, which is an Ontario pension plan. So our purpose is to serve, and I'm actually honored to serve over 100,000 Ontario public servants and workers in the charitable sector in the province to secure their pension over the long term.
Hi, Tim Brown with Nunavut Tunngavik, Assistant Director of Economic Advancement. I don't know much about pension plans, but I sure do want to find out a lot more about them. But I'm here to be able to talk about the strides we've been taking in Nunavut with regards to infrastructure.
And Paul.
Hi, everyone. Paul Gruner. First and foremost, can everybody hear me okay? Am I coming across loud and clear?
Yes, you are.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So sorry I couldn't be with you today. Travel was a bit prohibitive. So I'm calling in from Yellowknife. I'm with Talicho Investment Corporation, located here in Northwest Territories. I've spent the last almost 15 years working in the Indigenous business space. This is actually my 4th development corporation, 3 of which were directly within dealing with critical minerals. And I've had the opportunity to work across Yukon, Alaska, Northern BC, and Northwest Territories.
Thank you for those introductions. I want to start off by not trying to be too cute, but maybe say something that might be a little controversial in this room. In my experience as an investment banker and a leader of Canada's leading credit rating agency, I would say that there is no shortage of capital nor practical impediments to investing in, this is the caveat, well-designed projects that meet a real-world need. Think public and social infrastructure projects, to pick 2 examples, that have adequate and transparent governance, that have sufficient risk-sharing model in place, and produce an adequate rate of return for whoever is investing, as well as multi-stakeholder support to proceed, which takes me back to the governance issues. So that's all easy to say. I would argue it's much harder to implement. And my question is, somebody call me out on that, tell me that's not true, but I believe it to be. So maybe, Tim, do you have a perspective on that?
Thank you. I actually agree with you. I think that there is enough money, there's enough interest if the projects are, everything equal, worthy to invest in. The issue is around how do you get those projects to that state? And a lot of that is defining roles and responsibilities for different players. So Arctic infrastructure, or infrastructure in the Arctic, is not going to have a really good rate of return without a cash injection, a capital injection from the federal government. But that's just a development issue. Like, you need to, that's a fact. You have to take that into consideration. So if you have that in there, and you have other players that you can trust to be able to deliver that, like Inuit orgs and DevCorps, and you have a relationship with the public government in terms of the government of Nunavut, and the design and meeting the needs and filling gaps around that, then you can start to think about being able to try and attract that private financing that you need for those projects.
Paul, how do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm 100% aligned, and I always like to give examples. So I'd like to draw back actually on my experiences with Tahltan Nation, which is where I was just before joining Talicho. So if you look at for the Tahltan region, 15 years ago or so, they built a large-scale power distribution and lit that area up. And as a result of that, you now have two large mines that are on that power grid. That area is known as the Golden Triangle. And if you fast forward to today, they're expanding one of those mines, and you've got several that are into advanced development. And there's $3 billion that's now on the table that's being spent, all industry, to expand and grow, never mind the 85 plus exploration sites, right? So I think it's a great example where if you start to de-risk it with key infrastructure, and that power was developed in partnership with Indigenous and the province of BC, funded through federal government, that has really advanced some of those critical mineral projects, and the Indigenous group being materially involved in it.
Darren, I know you've got some scar tissue on a real-world project also.
Yeah, again, an example, the Iqaluit International Airport. There's a model, there's a project that's, met all the criteria that you've laid out, Doug, and more. Recognizing that, that contract and that project was entered into in 2015. Great economic benefits going into the community, but if we were to do that project today, it would look much different in that we would be pursuing, co-equity investor, co-equity development with local Inuit partners, Development Corp. So that's the opportunity. The real challenge that we're seeing in the jurisdiction as we look for new opportunities and new projects is really one of capacity on the part of the government. In the very first instance, just to enter into an exploratory commercial conversation about the realm of the possible, and then extend that through to actually prioritizing projects and communicating the priority and the interests and the objectives of what the governments want to deliver as projects. So that's kind of the landscape. But in terms of, is it a good place to invest? Is there opportunity? We're there, and I can tell you, we're prepared to continue to be there, continue to invest, and look for new opportunities to help meet the infrastructure gap in that jurisdiction.
Thank you. Daryl, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Sure. In terms of investment, global investors, et cetera, from my perspective, would they be interested in investing in Indigenous-led infrastructure? Having said that, is any investor a good investor? And secondly or thirdly is, what would the Indigenous communities expect from the investment? What would we need to attract that? And lastly, I guess, from experience in the North, in the Northwest Territories, not every investor is a good investor. And number two is, I think there's going to be some, engagement with the Indigenous development corporations and the Indigenous governments, and looking at what is it that the investor is expecting, and vice versa. What do the Indigenous governments want from the investor, et cetera. So But one point I'd like to make is recently joined the First Nations Major Project Coalition Board of Directors, and we've been working on a file on a national Indigenous loan guarantee program, so we can have some loans that will be affordable, I'll put it that way, for projects. I mean, there's billions of dollars worth of projects in the Northwest Territories, and we all know about that. But once a guarantee is in place, then I think maybe there will be some engagement with the investors. Because that was one of the questions that came up at our first session about 5 years ago, that investors would not invest in the North unless there was a government guarantee.
Both you and Darren have touched on two topics that I want to come back to. One is capacity building, and the other, I think what is partly implied in your answer, is about asymmetrical risk and asymmetrical knowledge going into projects. And so I want to spend a little time on that in a few minutes. Alison, Hillary, Shahir, do you guys have views on this question?
I do. And I think it's, you know, these projects are relative. So think about the cost of building major infrastructure, bringing transmission up to like Nunavut, you know, first land-based connection if it gets through. You're talking billions of dollars of infrastructure for a very small population to cover the cost, to service that debt. So you have to right-size your grants with private sector investments, including Inuit investment into those projects. And that's where, you know, and I'm not going to just chirp about the CIB, but we can bring concessionary capital. We can take risks that private investors aren't going to take. We can take risks that those mines that say they're coming, that want that power, we can take risk on future revenues where private sector is not going to be willing to take those risks. And so right-sizing federal grants, bringing in private capital, making sure that programs like a loan guarantee or our own equity lending initiative ensures that Indigenous communities have access to capital so they can be owners of the infrastructure that serves their communities. And if we had had those tools before, I'm sure that the Iqaluit Airport would have included Inuit ownership. And so I think there's still a number of tools. On the capacity, you're absolutely right. And governance, capacity around governance, but capacity around how to project finance. It's not the same as just taking a corporate loan when you're getting into a project finance model, and it's, you know, a lot of the communities are being run by really well-meaning, very smart people, but they don't have MBAs and finance degrees, and they're not surrounded in that in the Arctic. And so making sure that they have access to good advisors and good training. And, you know, there's a new program being launched with the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association to create a micro-certification for project finance so that communities who are getting into these large infrastructure initiatives have some skills and some background and understand sort of the risk reward, because, you know, everything can be the next, you know, casino and the next wealth generator. Communities want long-term stable returns, just like pension funds. They want the infrastructure, and that's a huge benefit to their communities, and they want to be a part of Canada's economy. So that's what I'd say.
Alison,
I'll add that I don't have all the expertise of everybody else around the table here, but I'm pretty focused on pools of capital in my day-to-day job. And I agree with you that I think the money is here. The question is what needs to happen for that money to be deployed. For sure, all the conditions that you've mentioned and all the panels you mentioned, governance, access, training, all of those are critical conditions, but I think the key ingredient in all this is still the money. And we have to catalyze the deployment of that capital into Arctic infrastructure and, quite frankly, into a lot of things that Canada needs. And I've shared with a few of you that you can't travel around the world without someone telling you about how great our pension funds are. And they all want to meet our pension funds, anyone that's spent any time in Europe or Asia or the Middle East. Could you tell me about your pension funds? because our government, I think, our governments, I think, are hitting about capacity in terms of dollars and/or resources to make the mega-billion-dollar, or several mega-billion-dollar concessions. So we have to find that capital elsewhere, and it's not fair to ask the pension funds to do it without appropriate pricing, return, risk, because that is a pensioner's money, and so if we want to access that capital, we have to do it very, very carefully. You're the expert in that, but I love to find ways to deploy that capital to meet, the huge needs that exist in the Arctic.
Allison, that's a perfect entry for you.
I think a couple of people have made the point, and Daryl, you said it too. Not every investor is a good investor. I think the very key point here, and you raised it, is really about alignment and understanding the investment objectives of different pools of capital. So it's been fascinating for me, obviously, to see the debate. I have a strong public policy background, and I've been in the pension industry now in and around it for about 6 or 7 years. So I can understand where some of the disconnect sits. Pension plans have been set up for a sole purpose of ensuring our members' financial security over their retirement. That is our purpose. That's why we exist. That's what we've been put in place to do. So it's really critical with us or with any counterparty with a pool of capital to actually understand their investment purpose and the mandate and restrictions that exist around that purpose for a good reason. Even the pension plans themselves do not actually have the same investment mandates, and that's also not understood. So, OP Trust or Ontario Teachers, we are what's called a defined benefit pension plan, so that means we have a very understood liability stream, and our job is to make investments to pay those liabilities with the least risk possible. So our job is to minimize our risk to ensure that money exists for our pensioners. Others have a more return-driven mandate. So they have to earn a certain amount of return, and so they could be maybe a little bit more risk on. So again, there's tons of detail. Then within that, you've got to find the teams and understand what their investment objectives are. So I would just say, especially being in the sustainability space, people often confuse sustainability, ESG, and impact. I do not use the word impact ever at work because people immediately think it's concessionary, and we are forbidden by law to take concessionary investments. As Hillary mentioned, she has a different investment mandate, and she is able to do that. So it's really about understanding kind of the pools of capital around you, what their mandates are, and figuring out if you can get an aligned pool of capital that's de-risked. And then, again, some will take full bets on investments. We never will. We like to be in a partnership and a consortium. So again, there's lots of nuance underneath the curtain that's really critical to figure out how you get those right partners around the table to make something happen. And we can speak to examples later, but just at a high level, I thought it's valuable to make that point.
And recognizing that concert infrastructure isn't one of Canada's large public pensions, but on the point of investment objectives and interests, as I said, our shareholders are 10 British Columbia-based union and management pension plans, many of which are trade unions. So as part of their objectives, as part of my objectives, one is obviously, as Allison said, a financial objective, but there's 2 other kind of key objectives of the shareholders. One is to build in Canada and to build with union labor. So that, again, kind of deviates from that strict financial objective. And the third objective is really to ensure the projects that we're delivering and the communities that we're in, that we are making both an economic and social impact. So it's a broader kind of objective and interest than just a strict financial interest.
It's an important distinction.
And that's a very powerful point, right? So you're mandated by your board and members with a certain thing. I have a different mandate. You have a third mandate. So really getting that understood is just so very, very important.
I want to make a public service announcement on something I've been banging around on Bay Street for a few years now, trying to get traction on. And it speaks to capacity building. I think there's an opportunity for the banks and maybe the pension plans, some of the big pools of capital here in Toronto, to set up a program that brings in, pick a number, 12 First Nations, Indigenous, smart young people from their communities to do 3 months or 6 months on Bay Street to learn some of those technical skills, but more importantly, to build a network and to be able to speak the lingo and not be intimidated when a hotshot banker shows up in their community and tries to bamboozle them with terms that they've never heard of before. I think there's a real opportunity for that in this city, in this country. So if anyone wants to join me, it's a crusade I'm on. Yeah.
I think one thesis I've been trying to advance is you've got two examples of two mandates here that are actually completely different, both legitimate but different. There's another example, and it's the case of Depot in Quebec, which says invest the money for the pensioners, derive a return. I have the words in French, but basically while considering or doing something good for the Quebec economy. Isn't there potentially a bridge, and I know a lot of people don't like this, a lot of people like it, a lot of people don't like it, but that type of an overlay that we can think about when we think about other investment mandates, not necessarily what we trust, but other ones where we could say, listen, yes, let's invest for the highest possible returns, but let's see if we can also animate our economy domestically in some way, because I agree that neither your mandate nor your mandate will on their own, because you make excellent points. The question is, should we tamper with the mandates such that we can do more domestically? For sure, there are a lot of issues that, pensioners' money, first and foremost. Secondly, people are really nervous about government meddling, right? So if you say animate the Ontario economy, does that mean Premier Ford's going to call and say, do this and don't do that, or Prime Minister Trudeau? That is something people don't want politicians anywhere close to these investment decisions using pensioner money. So if we can solve those problems, maybe kind of a dual mandate approach is something that we should think about. Maybe not appropriate for everybody, but maybe appropriate for some of the pensioners.
Yeah, just to build on that, there's a couple of other ways potentially to think about it. I first started getting involved in the pension industry in the U.S., where they do have, call it, very politically controlled pensions. Many of them are well underfunded and in some instances close to bankrupt. So everyone likes it when they've got an idea that they want funded. They like it less when, not because anyone intends for someone's pension to be underfunded, but, oh, we'll just borrow a bit here, we'll borrow a bit there. I mean, you got to really be guardrailed against that, because it's not your money, it's my members' money. Our members are modest earning and they need that pension, and that's our commitment to them. And my colleagues in the pension industry feel the same way. But in the spirit of the point, which I think is important, on how do we create aligned pools of capital, I mean, we could, and we arguably did, have ample opportunity to take revenue out of our resource economy and create separate pools of capital, or we could take that out of all sorts of places where there's pools of capital and create a more sovereign style of investment vehicle. There's a very compelling example in Australia, again, economy very much like ours, a country very much like ours. It's called the Future Fund. There are 7 funds within them. They have different investment purposes. Many of them do achieve policy outcomes, but they are all mandated very clearly, and then they invest according to that. So they've got one that manages medical research because they want to have more returns over that. They have one that manages the disability insurance program. So there are lots of other, potential vehicles that we could create as a country that would allow us to advance, I think, the point you're making. I mean, CIB would be another one that we actually do have. So that's, I think, very possible and a powerful potential policy lever that we could be talking about while still preserving the very important critical role that pension plans do play in Canadians' lives.
Very good point. Paul, do you want to have final word on this topic?
It's like, no.
Sorry, guys. Just having some Wi-Fi challenges here, so hopefully you can still hear me okay. But yeah, I mean, that was the Frank Gutra article talking about, pensions playing a more meaningful part in raising Canada. I think the only part I would make or point I'd make on that, conceptually great, but let's not lose sight of the fact that these pension funds are there for a return. And I think that at that point, government has to play a part in de-risking that if we're going to be relying on pension funds and propping that up. And it does fall into the lens of ESG.
At some point, we do have a couple of examples where we have partnered with Indigenous communities, with governments, and with, call it, non-concessionary capital to make projects happen. So there's lots of track record of that, or some. So it's not like it can't happen. It can, and it does. It just, ideally, I think probably everyone here would love it to happen more. So it may be valuable to spend some time on that later, too.
Yes, and if we have time, I do want to talk about some sort of best case examples and some less than best case, so we'll get to that. I want to pivot to ESG. Yesterday's article in the Globe, the first sentence said, ESG is dead, long live ESG. The article went on to talk about the battles in the United States, largely from right-wing Republicans, at both the state and the federal level against ESG investing, particularly for state and taxpayer funds. But it concluded that the topic's evolving. My parent company, Morningstar, owns one of the leading ESG companies in the world. I would say it's also a Canadian company, and it was founded right here in Toronto. It's called Sustainalytics. They're finding the term ESG, particularly in the US, is a bit of a toxic phrase, and it sends everybody down a rabbit hole of things you don't want to go because it's terribly unproductive. So they're finding that it's being substituted with a more generic term of climate initiatives. You can kind of make what you want out of that. But that sustainability reporting is being made mandatory in many jurisdictions around the world, particularly for the Europeans in the room. You certainly see it in most European jurisdictions. We've concluded that ESG, or climate sustainability metrics, are not going away, but are being hardwired into investment criteria in many markets around the world. So I'm curious to know if the panel thinks ESG is a fad or is here to stay. Who wants to weigh in on ESG?
I don't mind taking that one. I don't think it's a fad. I think it's hardwired, just like corporate governance and Sarbanes-Oxley internal controls. I think that our suppliers, customers, employees, partners, neighbors expect business and all investment to be thoughtful and multidimensional in terms of the assessment of a particular business or investment opportunity. So the words may change, but I think and as a matter of fact, I think measuring and reporting on sustainability and social issues will continue to be very, very important, even if the nomenclature changes.
I'd agree completely. I think it's more than just climate, though, and it's more than just social. Because that governance piece is so critical, and we see this on the makeup of boards and how we run our organizations and the senior folks in our organizations. And there still is a lack of diversity, and there's a lack of gender balance. And we need to kind of continue to move that yardstick. And certainly, when we look at investments, the first question our deal team asks, who are the Indigenous people that are involved in that project? And if there aren't Indigenous people who are owners of that project, how are they being involved? How are you procuring with them? So we are trying to bring in reconciliation. And so I think the nomenclature may change from ESG to sustainability, but if you're just focused on climate, you're really missing broader aspects that sustainability represents, and sustainability for long-term investments that are inclusive of diverse populations, of gender, and really reflect our society, our values, and our norms in Canada.
In order for that to be broadly accepted, though, you have to define risk-weighted rates of return to include other types of return. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's a tougher putt, but I agree with you. It has to. There's a place for it in the investment stack.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm responsible for this area for our plan, so maybe I'll just add a couple of things. First is the importance of clarity of terms. I think, so ESG, for those who have been probably fortunate enough to stay out of these debates, stands for environmental, social, and governance. What does that mean to you, right? So those are very broad terms. The way that I try to articulate in our organization is that it's a framework for understanding risk and return, and it really looks at non-financial or pre-financial information that is going to impact the sustainability of that investment over time. So for example, if you're polluting in the river and you could get away with that for a long time, you know, and nobody cared, it's actually not material, sadly, to an investor. Nowadays, you can't do that, either because social license to operate or you get fined or whatnot. So that's now material. That's just a crude example. Labor is a very important one, as you raised. Your relationship with your community. We're a union-supported pension plan. For us, that matters a lot. For you, too. So these are all things that are actually extremely material to the outcome of the investment. Now, unfortunately, because ESG, so we would consider them and we are required to consider them. But unfortunately, because that term has been used and politicized, partially because it was never well defined and it was in the eye of the beholder and it got mixed up with concessionary investing and impact investing and 1,000 other terms, coupled, may I say, with the politicization of the pension sector, as per my earlier comments, not a good idea. We're now into sort of a culture war over, really, again, people's retirement income. There's numerous examples already coming out of some of the states that have put anti-ESG legislation in place. The investment fees that those pension managers are now paying are going up out the roof because a lot of the kind of well-integrated ESG product that's just like what everybody is doing is now illegal. So everyone has to create specialized investment products, which is costing hundreds of millions of dollars in manager fees. Again, that's coming out of pensioners' pockets, not politicians' pockets. So it's really unfortunate, I think, what's happening, and I am hopeful, I think, as you are, that it's a blip. Serious investors are looking at this and will continue to look at this. And again, I pray that framing doesn't come north, but we lost Paul. But there's always that risk. So I think it comes back to being crystal clear about your terms and your mandate and making sure that that's well understood by your stakeholders.
Yep. Anyone else have a take on that?
Yep.
Or maybe I'll jump in if I can. Oh, sorry. Paul? I had to turn my camera off. I'm having some Wi-Fi issues here. I'm very, very sorry, guys.
Yeah, no worries.
But no, I also think, when you look at ESG, it's not a fad. I think it's just maturing, and it takes time to get there. And if you look at a lot of the certifications, you're starting to see financial institutions that are looking at ESG and saying, okay, CPA, CFA, they're all looking at that now and start taking that over and quantifying that. And I think part of this process is simply from a global perspective is getting alignment of what we're actually measuring and quantifying. So it's not going to go away. It's a maturing process. And I think it's very meaningful here in Canada, particularly when you look at the resource sector and you look at Indigenous inclusion.
I'm more worried about ESG or greenwashing than I am about the standards becoming, non-applicable, because in all the noise, everyone wants to now put a sustainability or ESG or something page on their website, which really just meaningless. Often it's just words with no action. And so we're diluting the real intent of the ESG, quote unquote, movement. So I'm more worried about that greenwashing or ESG washing than I do worry about the substance of ESG disappearing.
What I would say is certainly in Europe, the ESMA, the financial markets regulator, is also worried about greenwashing, and boy, they're all over it. So I think there's less of a chance of that happening in the European markets than maybe here. Daryl?
ESG in our language, we say istia means take it easy. So when you define or translate, well, it's not translating it because I'm just telling you. A lot of the discussions in the community is basically that's what they're saying. Take it easy, right? You don't go in and just trample the land, the water, the wildlife, etc. So there's environmental, social, and governance issues. How are you going to govern yourself? And what's the benefit of that? Of course, the benefit is both ways. It's for the proponent and for the community and for the territory. And of course, environmental speaks for itself. But it's the question that came to me was very blunt. If the caribou started coming through the site, will you shut down the project? I don't think that's, no, I think that's doable because it's being done in the Red Dog mine in Alaska. They actually shut down the road when the caribou were crossing. So is that going to kill the project? Is a few hours or a couple of days going to kill the project? No, it doesn't, because in the north you have winter blizzards that shuts you down for a couple of days. So what's the difference? So I just wanted to add that view. Yeah.
That's an important perspective because it doesn't have to be black and white. Mm-hmm. There's lots of room for gray in projects like that. That's a great example. For those in the audience looking at the screens, that is the Decho Bridge across the Mackenzie River. It is the first structure across the Mackenzie River, and I had the great privilege of being part of the financing team at TD Bank that put that one together. So it's nice to see it. Pardon me? I knew that. Paul, anything on ESG in your world?
I'll try this again with the camera. We'll see how this works. Yeah, I don't really have much I can really add on that. Like I said, it's sort of evolving. It's challenging, and there's lots of opportunities out there for that, right? But we've got to keep leaning in and be intentful on it.
Yeah. Tim.
Yeah, just to jump in on it, I don't have much in terms of ESG dead, not dead. I really hope it's not dead because we really need it. And that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of understanding where our growth has been in terms of the Indigenous Community Infrastructure Fund from Budget 2021. Has been sort of, it's not the start of our capacity because DevCorps have been doing infrastructure development in the north on a traditional financing basis. But this is the first time that we've had access to sort of grant money to be able to try and see about what kind of infrastructure, what are our immediate aspirations, and bringing up some really strategic conversations in terms of roles and responsibilities around what kind of infrastructure should be developed by who. And then when you're looking at that, you just say, okay, so if you're going to wait for the government to build you a water treatment plant and it takes 8 years, how does that help your Inuit constituents that are living in that community? So it's just been the start of a conversation like that to bring this up to the next level. The reason I'm interested in this conversation now is that because of the work that we've done in terms of deploying that infrastructure funding, we're starting to see that, wow, we know from 2020, like we've got a big gap in infrastructure in Nunavut. That's a fact. So then the question is, okay, so how do we go about eating that elephant bite by bite? So where are the, what are the tools that we need to be able to do that? And right now, to Hillary's point, is that we need more of that capacity to be able to just play the game. So to your point also in terms of learning the lingo and just how the system works. Even just right now, I'm learning about, there's different mandates in terms of ESG, there's different mandates on that. So I'm like, Jessica, we need a different set of panels for next year. On conciliatory capital, is that what we're looking for? Yeah. Concessionary capital, but much more lean or patient or gentle capital in terms of being able to match the socioeconomic development for Nunavut that way. One of the biggest criticisms you're hearing all around in terms of financing development in the north is a boom and bust cycle of federal investments, and that's just not doing it. Like, and so we talk about economic development strategy, we need a socioeconomic development strategy, or just a plain old development strategy in terms of saying, okay, so how are we going to bring these metrics up? Like in terms of your comment about, like in the old days, you could pollute a river and let it go. Well, in my mind, as you were saying that, I was like, well, we're watching, you know, year after year go by with not very, we're not seeing the increase in graduation rates. Other socioeconomic and socially determinant of health statistics improve. And that is a polluted river that just keeps on getting polluted. Like it's in that type of equivalent. So how do we stop that? Where do you bring ESG or put the social back in the S there, like in terms of that concern? And so we are, like right now, we just have finished a 2-day meeting with Paul and the Infrastructure Housing Advisory Committee, where we're actually now going to start looking to develop a strategic impact investment fund for Nunavut, to be owned and controlled by Nunavut Inuit. But we're just at that stage to learn what the panel here knows. So.
Speaking of social, Madeleine Redfern, I don't know where Madeleine is at the moment, but she made a very impassioned plea around food security. It's nice to talk about lofty terms like ESG, but things like food security go right to the heart of people's basic needs to survive. So I think that's important to remember that. I was very emotional when I heard that. Paul, you mentioned Frank Gustra and Pierre Lalonde in the article they wrote yesterday. For those who don't know, they are two of Canada's great mining entrepreneurs. And they made an impassioned argument for Canadian pension plans to invest more in Canada. They didn't say it has to be concessionary. They didn't say it has to be impact. Their argument was that Canadian pension plans have invested multiple amounts more in China than they have in Canada. And I thought that was a provocative way for them to make the argument that pension plans should be doing more to invest in Canada. So I guess one of the questions for federally regulated pension plans, and I get that this is provocative, but should they be mandated to invest more of their investable assets, not on concessionary terms, but in the Canadian market as opposed to offshore? I'm an investment banker by training. I get that that is a crazy notion, but I'd love to hear our panel's insight on that.
Maybe I can start. And now, more recently, with the critical mineral strategy and the critical mineral endowment, probably, especially in the north that I know of, and probably right across Canada. And Tim brought up a good point. We can't just be investing in once every 2 years or once every 5 years or once every 10 years. In the Northwest Territories, any major investment was last made in 1960, and by the government for the hydro dams and for the highways for stimulating the mining sector. 1960. What year is it? I think we're in the next century. So I think the solution to that might be like a recurring revenue, budgeting for recurring investment in the north. So, it's that the Indigenous governments, DevCorps, or the territorial governments are not going hand in hand to Ottawa on a constantly trying to get infrastructure dollars. And and because infrastructure is the backbone of this country, and I think if there's some sort of inter-cooperation arrangement between the Indigenous governments, the territorial and industry, I think we have a good argument to ensure there's a recurring, a strategic plan, really, for infrastructure in the north that'll benefit not only the industry, it'll benefit the communities who have food security issues. It'll benefit the national defense of this country. So it's a multiple positive impacts that we're talking about.
I've got Tim and then Shahir.
Yeah, sorry, one other piece I missed. In terms of valuation of social impact, there is an economic number, there's a value in terms of that graduation rate, in terms of participation in the economy that needs to be taken into consideration. And that's a piece that I'm personally interested in terms of being able to show that, in terms of what that return is. It's not just that you're going to get your percentage back, patient capital, but you're also having, like, what is that economic investment for raising that graduation rate, just on that, or improving a medical rate, like a health rate or whatnot. Like, there's an economic value to that that is being missed, or that, or from what I understand, is being calculated in other funds. And that's something that's very interesting in terms of being able to show, to measure that marker, to be able to move forward on it. And you don't get that without being able to have, to be able to get out of that budget cycle. Because right now, like, the approach in terms of funding infrastructure in a traditional, conventional 20th century style has been kind of eyedropper and show me the business case for your single project, as opposed to, we need 25 of everything in Nunavut. So it's coming in a bundled package. Half of the power plants are probably that old and that need to be replaced. But do you replace them with diesel, or do we look at in terms of how do we do that disruptor and change it to clean energy now? Like, but we're never ready to have that conversation. And this is kind of also why we're, from NTI's perspective, investing in an infrastructure needs assessment to go beyond that gap report, because it helps everybody understand. It's a 40, it's a 70, like the ITK pre-budget submission for 2023 on infrastructure came out to $75 billion. I'm like, okay, at least it's a starting point. Let's go with $75 billion. How do we take it from 75 to 3, which was our first try at it? But you can't do that without having the needs. And I heard Patrick in the earlier panel be mentioning, say, tell me you're ready for the project, and I'm ready to come to the table. And so that's kind of where being able to have these things laid out, to be able to understand, really, to fix the transportation sector in Nunavut, it's going to be $50 billion. Okay, that's $50 billion. So part of that's going to come from the feds, and then where are we going to get the rest to be able to do that? And Inuit definitely want to be part of that mix in there, and that's why we need to build our own capacity to be able to do that.
So I agree with that comment that Tim made, that the return on investment has to be measured beyond just the actual financial return on investment. You have to look at employment, tax revenue, et cetera. However, I don't think, to be direct, that is something that that's something the taxpayers should bear, not the pensioners. Yeah. Just to be clear. And so to come to your question, it's a subtle but important difference. Should the pension funds be mandated to invest in Canada? There are those that are lobbying the Minister of Finance and others directly on this point, and you will have seen in the fall economic update that Minister Freeland actually said, and I think she did the right thing, we will engage in a dialogue. There was no mandate, there were no criteria, there were no thresholds, and a dialogue is good. But I think mandating, for example, I was with a group that said the pension funds must invest X% in Canada. I think that's dangerous for all the reasons we've already discussed: pensioners' money, political interference, et cetera. However, the subtle change I want to make is, although they shouldn't be mandated, maybe their mandates could be broadened so that they can consider the impacts of their investments on the Canadian economy. So it is not you are obliged to invest in Canada, but rather make as much money as you can while considering the Canadian economy. It's it is, and I'm motivated by what the Caisse de dépôt and Quebec have done, because while the case isn't hitting, it's beating its benchmarks. It's not doing the same as CPPIB by a few basis points, but it's hitting its benchmarks. At the same time, the manner in which it's animating the Quebec economy is creating jobs, tax revenue, talent pool, expertise pools. It'd be great to be able to replicate that, again, without mandating a specific level of performance, because the criteria of returns go beyond the actual ROI on the investment, go to providing infrastructure, jobs, training, healthcare, prisons, infrastructure, everything that Canada needs and everything that the Arctic needs. So I'm in favor of looking at this a bit more creatively, but without going as far as creating a mandate that says, invest or else.
I think the fear out there is when a politician is directing investment objectives and investment mandates. I think, if you recognize if the board of directors, if the shareholders, if the beneficiaries themselves look at their investment objectives and interests and decide that there needs to be a change, I think a logical assessment would make sense. Again, the fear here is that you have ministers and politicians directing or seemingly directing pension plans to change investment objectives.
Aaron, you listening back there?
Valuable, again, a lot of, how you define the problem, influences how you solve it. This is an issue which lacks a very clear problem definition, and and this is Alison Lowe speaking, just to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of anything other than myself. We have multiple pools of government-directed capital. We have business, the BDC, we have EDC, we have the new Growth Council thing that's being run out of Quebec. I'd be very interested to see an extremely open and transparent conversation of what that has done. Like, we've got examples already live where politicians are directing capital. We've got all the development ACOAs and the Fed, all the different development corps that already exist. I'd love a clear-eyed analysis of is that model actually effectively achieving the policy objectives outlined, right, before we throw something at yet another pool of capital. Like, I do think it really requires a step back, clear definition of what we're trying to achieve, an understanding of efforts in the past, whether they've been successful or not. Can we tweak something that already exists? Again, pension money is not the government's money. It's individual Canadians' money. And so we just have to be very careful. I mean, I would have a different view. I think the dialogue is good, but we should define the problem well and actually set up some good analysis on what we might have learned from existing efforts to direct capital and how that's worked and what we could do differently before we layer in yet another set of organizations into this issue.
I think that's a good caution note.
I sat on the board of the BDC for 9 years, and some of the business lines were losing a good amount of money. And we asked at the board, none of this is very secret, like, how do we justify losing tens of $millions on this particular initiative? And so management went back and came and reported to the board, well, fine, we are, as an organization, we have lost this money on this product line. But look at the impacts we have had in terms of job creation, wealth creation, tax revenue, training, diversity and inclusion initiatives. And in the end, to a person at the board, we said, that was worth it, that loss, in terms of the output and the results for Canada. So I think that those measures are very, very important, and sometimes you do lose financially in one pocket, but you're gaining tremendously in the other pocket. None of this to say that the pensioner, again, I'm not saying the pensioner should be the one to bear that, but I'm saying somewhere in Canada, we have to find a way that we measure the outputs beyond just basis points. And maybe we got to leave a few basis points on the table in exchange for being able to generate some of these other massive returns. And just to say, in terms of the size of the pools, the Maple 8, I think, have $2 trillion. BDC, CIB, EDC, none of them come anywhere close, even in the aggregate, to that kind of capital. So unfortunate as it is, yeah. And even the Canada Growth Fund that you mentioned's only got it's got $15 billion. It's all relative.
Allison?
Yeah,
Oh,
well, I was just
so-
going to make one other. I may also just suggest that, lest it be repeated, the statement about the China investment, I find contestable. It's certainly very incorrect in our plan.
Okay.
So I just might suggest don't let anyone repeat that, because I'm shocked, and I bet I'm surprised it holds for any plan. I mean, most of us have 20% in Canadian bonds, just for example.
Yeah.
So it's just, I'd be interested to see the research supporting that assertion.
Yeah.
The only comment I would make on this conversation about mandating pension plans, and I'm a former GN employee, so please don't hurt my pension. Yeah, GN, Government Indian, sorry. But I do think like the issue isn't so much about mandating, but it is about creating the conditions that plans want to have a certain percentage of their portfolio investing in the Arctic. And so that really is about layering these issues, about finding the partnerships with Canada Infrastructure Bank, with the federal government, in that understanding that you cannot make a return anywhere close to what you're going to experience anywhere outside of the Arctic in the Arctic. So let's figure out what it is that we need to do to be able to attract that capital with the right investors.
It's an economic leakage, I guess, and not pensions, but just private equity. I mean, there's billions leaving this country all the time, right? And for the criteria that's set either by the shareholders or by the investment criteria that's developed. And that's probably pure free economics at work. I mean, if we had to invest in Canada, under those circumstances, it'll probably be in the cities, right? Not in northern remote areas. So how do we solve that? Instead of mandating, I think, very similar to the mineral exploration tax credit, where you incentivize investors to invest in your project. Is there something that we can look at in terms of incentivizing investors that invest in the north? And like a tax credit or et cetera. I mean, those are tools that have been used for years and years.
What we need is a layer of sorry.
Yeah, sorry. And how can we create that burning platform other than what's happening in the globe around us, like the wars or the Russian, the Ukrainian, the Middle East, et cetera. China trying to corner the critical mineral market, or they do have that, but and other things, right? So what burning platform other than what's happening do we need to make this happen? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, sorry, I think what we need in all these, in terms of accessing capital, is you do need a layer of concessionary capital that's not the pension funds and not the banks, probably the government, that's prepared to take the risk in some structured products that you'd be an expert in. Say, we'll take the highest risk, and on top of us, will sit others who have higher levels of return, less risk, properly priced, and maybe that's the product that we have to, come up, say, we will take risk capital to the extent of, X billion, provided we have private sector or pension fund investors who then come in on top of our concessionary capital.
The structured finance world is wildly creative in slicing and dicing risk and apportioning it to those that want to assume it and want the rate of returns attached to it. More importantly, want to take the risk attached to it. So the models do exist.
It's the model that the CIB deploys. We're concessionary, so we're low cost typically, but sometimes we're not at low cost because the risk is not a returns risk. It's that investors can't take the risk on whether or not you build it, they will come. And so we'll still be subordinated, and we can play anywhere in the capital stack. So we have a lot of flexibility, which is the kind of concessionality and this is the kind of gift that the Canadian taxpayers give. And we may lose the dollars, but we still want to see that infrastructure built. We want to see the impacts that infrastructure brings to community. And I want to go back to two things. One is, I think you hit the nail on the head with your opening comment about the vision, what's needed to bring in private capital, what's needed to attract the pensions to these investments. You hit it on governance, you hit it on sort of safe returns, there's all of the things that Alison talks about as what her pension would need to make an investment here. But then we go back to the lunchtime discussion with Aaron and Jim, and Daryl, you raised it. I think, when you're in the Arctic, you need to be thinking about infrastructure in a different way. If you want to build a critical mineral site, a mine, you can't just expect pensioners and private equity to come to play here. You have to be thinking about alignment of interests. You need to think about, how does this impact the communities? How are the communities benefiting from this infrastructure? You want to build a road and a deep water port, not even close to communities? Where are you going to get the social license for this? Because they're not going to benefit from having a deep water port finally in the middle of the Arctic in Canada, because that's not going to really help with their access to goods and services and transportation. So you have to be thinking about, from a holistic perspective, how do you think about security, the economic benefit to the region, the communities benefit from the infrastructure, and then just the economic and social growth that can come from that type of infrastructure, including the critical minerals that are being sought now. And I think Paul's the best person, I think, to speak to this, because he's seen this in the Golden Triangle. He's worked with the communities, and he's been able to align those interests with government, private sector, and Indigenous communities. And I think there's a huge opportunity in this country to do that across the far north and some of these more Arctic locations.
Just one second, Darren. Paul, this is a good opportunity for you to jump in, but I can't see if your hand is up or not, so please just wait in.
I'm here. It's all good. Yeah, so I think, where can we start working more, I think, with Indigenous communities, to Hillary's point, in that alignment? Indigenous groups are getting more sophisticated, right? So if you look at going back to Tahltan, for example, the largest run-of-the-river project in North America is in the Tahltan region, of which they have an equity piece in. It's a minority position, but that is a nice arbitrage between the rate of return and the interest being paid. And, thankfully, they locked in that debt long ago, right? So they get that nice arbitrage. You look at Tlicho, for example, they just built an all-season road. I think that was $250, $300 million, so not a massive infrastructure project, but not tiny. They own 25% of that, and that was basically an Indigenous P3 with a private partner, government-backed, right, for a long-term contract that made sense, that they could finance on, right? And the one that I think is not infrastructure-based, but I don't know if anybody caught this, but it was announced a couple of days ago. Nisga'a Nation owning about 75% of this through the Fiore Group, and that's Frank Grucha's group, and that is, I believe, the most significant will be pre-IPO of an Indigenous group in this country taking forward a royalty streaming company. And they're taking that public here, and I think that launches in 6-8 weeks or whatever, right? So maybe not infrastructure backed, but again, it's a good example of the sophistication of Indigenous groups as they start wrapping their heads around big business, big capital, and how to sort of tackle that. So, how do we start to really work with those groups, again, with an acceptable amount of risk, but unlocking some of the capitals that some of these Indigenous groups have and moving forward? One last piece to that, and this goes back to my experience working in Alaska, and it was with a Yukon Indigenous group that split the border with Alaska, so I actually had an office in Anchorage. When you look, and Daryl mentioned Red Dog Mine, that's NANA Corporation, and I think NANA owns 30% of Red Dog. You look at those Indigenous organizations operating in the state, of the 10 largest private businesses there, 9 of them are Indigenous. And the largest of them, Northern Slope, did $3.5 billion US last year. So if that's a trend line of what Canada is on, and maybe we're a generation or two back from that, being a national piece, the trend line is there. and the opportunities to unlock that. And if we work effectively across government, across industry, pension funds, Indigenous, we're going to get to a place where not only do Indigenous groups have a meaningful part of the economy, and it's a growing piece already, but they're going to continue to unlock opportunities, whether that be, the natural resource sector, critical minerals, land development. Look at Squamish Nation and unlocking critical housing needs in Vancouver. We all benefit from that, not just Indigenous groups, but a whole nation, and it becomes a rising tide lifts all boats. So how do we do this effectively across that entire platform, holistically, and unlock that value for all Canadians?
Good insight, Paul. Thank you. Darren?
Yeah, I mean, as you said at the outset, Doug, the capital's there. It's really about the conditions to attract that capital. And Concert Infrastructure, with one of the development corporations in Nunavut, put forward to the government a 7-point plan or action plan that we felt would start to lay that foundation for the right environment. And maybe very quickly, like the points in that plan were, one, like having a clear vision of what you're trying to achieve through infrastructure, having a long-term capital plan. Again, these are not novel things, like we see them here in Ontario, BC. They're kind of best practices for attracting capital and delivering infrastructure. So, project prioritization, so give us a clear view of what the priority of projects is. Procurement, we need to see efficient procurement processes, innovative procurement processes, ones that don't go on for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. As we know, the needs are immense in the north, and so let's just get on with it. The fifth was around delivery and ensuring that, not only we're delivering infrastructure, but we're achieving other public policy objectives for the north, whether that's economic benefits, whether that's social benefits. Again, pretty critical when you're making, you've got limited dollars to invest, so let's make sure that those investments are covering broader objectives. 6 was making sure that you're considering all sources of funding and financing in the capital stack. And then the 7th was really around, it's great to build the infrastructure, but are you thinking about how you're going to maintain it and life cycle it over the long term? So again, kind of best practices that we see in jurisdictions where we're investing quite often in the south, but opportunity for those governments in the north to adopt those best practices and hopefully attract the capital that they need.
So I don't know the answer to this, but where did you get with the government on those six suggestions? 7?
Not very far, unfortunately, but it's a continuing discussion.
Okay. We've got lots more that I can prompt, but we want to leave enough time for everyone in the audience. Yes, sir. Yeah, Dave, and then we'll go back to the back.
Thanks very much. Dave Perrin, the president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Fascinating discussing, although as an arts major, I'm not sure I caught all of it. Discussion tomorrow about... Okay, well, tomorrow about some of the planned defense investment. Are there actionable ways that some of the planned investments in several different airfields could potentially be leveraged for other community economic benefits? Like, are there templates for using federal planned investment dollars and, I don't know, doing some clever financial stuff with them in some different way to generate other community benefits?
Anyone have a view on that?
I mean, I would say absolutely. I mean, again, I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse here with the Iqaluit International Airport, but there's a project, that relies quite heavily on federal funding in the first instance, but layered within those obligations of the project agreement and the contract is economic benefits that go directly to the local community, to local businesses. And again, as I said at the outset, this is a 2015 project. If I was to invest and pursue that opportunity today, I would be doing it in full partnership with local Inuit Development Corps, equity investors and developers. And a big part of it would also be knowledge transfer, experience transfer in terms of building their capacity. As we've explored these types of opportunities and this strategy in the north, the way I've sort of characterized it is, at some point, what I'm trying to do is basically put myself out of business. So build the capacity within the local Inuit development corps and investment corps. And, it may not be this project, it may not be the second or third project, but perhaps by the fifth or the sixth, they won't need me. So there's absolutely opportunity there.
And I'd add, we've been doing that for a long time. Goose Bay, Labrador was created because of the Air Force Base, and it created a city, and that base is the main airport for Goose Bay, Labrador, and the Air Force is not super busy there. We can also deploy other military defense, so, I'm not all on D&D, and I'm sure some of you are, but there are submarines that are powered by nuclear, and they power the station by nuclear in the Arctic, Canadian military subs. And so think about the power that's being generated by those submarines, and yet the community that's not located next to it, but could have been positioned close, could have gotten off diesel, or at least offset a lot of that diesel, which, if you haven't been to Nunavut or any of these Arctic communities that rely on diesel generators, they're usually in the middle of town, and they spew this black stuff out, and all the kids breathe it in and have high rates of childhood asthma. When we talk about socioeconomic indicators, these are the things that we can, if we pair infrastructure and these opportunities together, and I think we need to work in collaboration, both with D&D and communities, and then look at the broader economic opportunities. We have an opportunity to really grow this much faster. We don't have to delay another 50, 100 years. We can start moving the yardsticks now.
I just want to say, in terms of building off of that, coming back to the conversation around mandating, it's not a good word, but trying to figure out a way to be able to encourage more IP3s, so Indigenous private public partnerships. And the CIB has that model, in terms of being able to say, there is a role for that Indigenous government organization to be able to play, and can be able to offset. So one of the things that we hear a lot in Nunavut, if you're trying to get into any kind of big investments, is going to be the debt cap. And the government has a debt cap. So how do you get around the debt cap? You need to find partners to be able to do that. And I think Inuit orgs are positioned to be able to do that, both not just in terms of being Inuit organizations, but they have capital, they have resources to be able to contribute to fixing a problem or filling a gap that way. But it's that model that we need to have, and making sure that it's clear. So I don't know if you need to mandate it, or make sure like Darren is saying, that the industry is saying, you know what, we really want those Indigenous partners. They must be there because it's a good thing to do. Instead of being, we must have it because we have to have it. We'd rather it's a good thing to do option.
For the non-Canadians in the room, there's two really good experiments going on right now on building small modular nuclear reactors. One in Saskatchewan and one a couple of hours east of here down the highway at Darlington Nuclear Generating Station. Stay tuned, because that could change the diesel model forever.
Could I bring forward just a cool example, just back to airports?
Yep.
Yeah, just very quick, and it's certainly not like a size of a caloe, but again, back to my experiences with Toltan. We actually had a dilapidated airport in the region, and working with, again, government, industry, in this case, Newcrest, that had the Red Chris mine site. Brought in $10-15 million and did a complete revamp of that airport, modern lighting, extended the runway. That airport today is now used for all shift changes, for crew and personnel. But to then extend that now, what does that mean for the community? So before that airport was modernized, it was upwards of 26 hours average time to get an air ambulance in. And once that was modernized with the modern lighting, et cetera, that was brought down to about 5.5 hours. So as a result of that partnership, not only did it benefit from a socioeconomic standpoint, but if we haven't saved a life yet, we certainly will by having that now reducing it by about 20 hours, right? So there's definitely trickle-down effect beyond just economics. These hit and impact at a community level.
Thank you. We have a question right at the back.
Hi, my name is Stephen Van Dyne. I'm principal at Arctic Unlimited. I've been a sustainable development practitioner in the northern space for government for about 30 years, working on a number of things that you might have heard about. I won't mention them now. I wanted to just come back to the original premise about shared risk, shared investment, and shared benefit. I think that's a common theme that's pretty important for the discussion here. But before I do that, I just wanted to lay out a couple of quick fact points that haven't come up to my knowledge so far. One is that Heather Exner-Pirro has written extensively about the fact that we don't have enough critical minerals on the planet to satisfy current need. So that's an important point, which I think makes the North an attractive place to spend some time building and investing in. The second is the Government of Canada currently spends about $6 billion annually supporting territorial governments on an ongoing basis. And as far as I know, the Government of Canada's checks, usually cash pretty good. So what does that mean? $6 billion on an annual basis to territorial governments to provide programs and services, including many assets. So I'll just come back to that point in a minute. The third, which everyone in the room has acknowledged today, is that the Canadian Arctic has the highest level of land claim settlements across the planet for the geographic area. So you've got a high level of FPIC ready environment to deal with some of the investment issues that come up through ESG and make it an attractive place to invest. And then finally, most recently, January 18th, Nunavut signed its devolution agreement, marking the last territory to deal with that. So I'll just quickly come to the question. The question is, given that the North is an important place for Canada to continue to invest in, and given that we've got a winning formula of shared risk, shared investment, shared benefit, to what extent can the investment community be working closely with the territorial governments to look at all the assets on the table, to look at that shared approach to investing differently? And I would encourage that if we just for a moment thought about territorial governments in an environment in which maybe they don't need to be in all the asset classes that they're currently carrying. I think you know that they all have borrowing limits that are quite constraining. But if there was a new ownership model that allowed for shared ownership, shared risk, and shared benefit, what that could mean in terms of opening up and realizing the potential. So before I'll put the question to you guys, that's a great question. That doesn't just, in my view, extend to the 3 territorial governments. You could ask that same question in the Maritimes. Shared provision of services make perfect sense in a number of jurisdictions here. Tim.
If I may, on that particular question around territorial governments, I just made a comment about 20th century thinking, and we're still there in terms of where the territorial governments are of managing their capital budgets. The government of Nunavut gets a little bit over $2 billion a year. It has decided that it has a 5-year capital plan worth $1 billion, so $200 million a year to deal with its capital projects. We've been, several different parties within Nunavut have been at pains to try and get the government to change its approach on this, to be able to say, maybe some years you need to go to 500, or maybe, what is that balance that you need to be able to strike? Part of the issue is that the government sees all capital projects as infrastructure. So retrofits, life cycle, all of that is lumped in the same conversation as what's the next infrastructure project that we need to develop the territory with. And that is a first step in terms of splitting that off, in terms of saying, look, we need to, like from a sustainability perspective, you shouldn't be building projects that you're not building in the life cycle for anyways. That's that. So trying to get the conversation back to where the infrastructure needs is and where we're going to be able to participate is a first step. It's a really hard step to get because of, you have to also acknowledge the government's capacity issues that they're experiencing also to be able to play in this new conversation. Sorry.
I just don't want you to kick it.
I was like, please don't put the mic there. I talk with my hands and my feet. So that was the one point. The other point is that we do need to get territorial governments to be able to understand that we are in this IP3 environment now, and that there are opportunities to be able to look at, rethink things like essential services at a municipal level. And it's an interesting conversation because we had it in terms of trying to figure out where to invest the ICIF funding, and the conversation was, well, isn't water treatment a government thing? And like, okay, but don't we need to drink clean water? Like, and then we can't wait for that water treatment plant to come on. And how do you deal with that? And that's kind of the conversations we're trying to have with the CIB to be able to say, okay, so what would it take? What kind of size loan would it take to upgrade and standardize all of the water infrastructure and have a role for Inuit Deaf Corps in it? But that changes your whole model of municipal life, right? And so you're taking all of the water truck drivers, all of that municipal capacity, and you need to transfer that over to a private Inuit Development Corp. So I just want to comment on that and to be able to say you want to say it, but you have to really look at, okay, where you're having. And I empathize with the reaction in terms of 7 simple points. This isn't rocket science. And this is another point about Nunavut. Like, don't come with state-of-the-art stuff. We're trying to get to industry standards on a lot of these different areas, right? So that advice is really good, safe stuff, but how do you make it happen? And you have to be able to get the government to feel comfortable enough, secure enough to be able to make that transition with you.
I might just add that, and Stephen, I think you've raised a lot of really good points. FPIC. So for those that don't know about the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, FPIC is a concept called free prior informed consent, and it's required by law now in Canada. It's loosely applied, I would say. But there are efforts to do more always. And so that's one piece that's really important because, frankly, if you're operating in the territories which are covered in land claims, this is an area, Nunavut is a really great example where they have their own environmental approvals. The Nunavut they make decisions on the environment there, and now with land evolution, it's even stronger. So if you're going to operate there, you need to operate in partnership and with consent of the Inuit. So they need to welcome you into their territory to do business there, whether it's water infrastructure in the hamlets or whether it's building a major transmission asset or a big port or a fueling station. You need to have the Nunavut Mute on side, and I think that that's a really important piece for business and for investors. And I think, I've heard from Darren, business is different today than it was when they first made the investment in the Iqaluit Airport. Now we would look at partnerships, economic partnerships and equity. I would say that it's still not that simple. And yes, there's these debt caps, there's limits. The territories are unique beasts in Canada, and if you haven't done any study on the territories, they are creatures of the federal government. They are different than the provinces. They have different legislative and regulatory oversight from the federal government and different funding envelopes and different funding formulas to support them. And it is not enough because it is in the Arctic and everything costs 10, 20, 30 times more to do up there. And it's not enough. That's why you have such high rates of youth suicide. You have, such high rates of poverty, and the housing situation is abysmal, across the Arctic. Some territories take a stronger stance. Some are still growing up. Nunavut's 20 years old, I can't remember, 30 years old. It's young. It's a baby in the sense of confederation. And it's a growing and very young population. It imports a lot of bureaucrats from the south because you just don't have that capacity in the north. And so building capacity for governance, building financial literacy capacity, all of these things, and making sure that kids finish their schooling and their education, and we continue to support that while also investing in economic opportunities alongside Inuit and the communities that live and thrive and are trying to thrive up there is just such a critical piece of the puzzle. And, you know, the government's, you know, so I mentioned the transmission asset. Well, you know, it requires a big government grant. And what does the government do? We're working with an Inuit Economic Development Corporation to make this project a reality. And what does the government of Canada do when you ask them, you have trying to right-size the grant, because you need grant money in this? They go to the government of Nunavut and say, well, what do you think? Should we support this? And the government of Nunavut says, well, we have billions of dollars of gaps. Like, I can't tell you to prioritize that over this and that and the other thing. There's so many gaps. But they can't. And so, you know, the government of Nunavut has to look at all of Nunavut and not just one small region getting connected. And so there's a lot of politics at play. And, you know, the feds are partly responsible, the territorial governments, and trying to figure out what's that right balance and bringing everybody to the table to actually move the yardsticks. And I think, Darren, we talked earlier about pilot projects. Like, sometimes just doing a pilot project, showing and doing a demonstration of how it could work in a territory where it hasn't happened before, it may be the answer.
Hilary, that is a brilliant summation of almost all the issues we talked about. Thank you for that.